Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Hope Thing, a podcast. My name is Crystal Cedino, and I am the Training and Development Manager for the Native Learning Center. With me today, I have my right hand, Cora Anthony. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Cora, and tell our guests hello.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Cora Anthony, the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center.
Beautiful. All right. Well, today we're going to be discussing site characterization with a few returning guests and one new one, which I'm excited to introduce. I love having new individuals on the show. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Cynthia Annette, a research associate professor at KSU and a data mapping maven who is also a Google Earth Outreach Network trainer. And then we also have Eugene Goldfarb, an adjunct professor at University of Illinois, Chicago, who retired after 30 years with HUD and has been a longtime NLC instructor. And last but not least, we have Scott Nightingale, who's the National Tribal Tab co-director. Welcome, Scott. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our guests who are not so familiar with you.
All right, thank you, Crystal. Scott Nightingale, as Crystal mentioned, I'm the co-director of the Tribal Technical Assistance to Brownfields program here at Kansas State University. It's Tribal Tab, and we assist tribes throughout the country with redevelopment of brownfields properties. We are free for tribes to use, and we're available at www.ksutab.org. Thanks.
Beautiful, thank you. Nice little plug in there. And we'll be sure to throw that back in at the end just so that we make sure our listeners get any assistance that they might need with brownfield or site characterization. Speaking of which, why don't we provide some context to our listeners on what site characterization is, why it's important, to our tribal members and tribes and so on and so forth. So anyone who wants to jump in, go right ahead.
We discussed earlier how tribal, I think Mark, who was in here today, he mentioned how, there was a derailment and a spill, and the tribal response program had to address an immediate threat to health and safety. So tribal response programs do that, but they also do things that aren't immediate threats. Let's say you have a property that's dilapidated, and it's not a positive effect on your community, but you don't know how much an adverse effect it is on health and safety. Well, the tribal response program can characterize that property and figure it out. Let's say you're the tribal housing authority and you want to develop new housing and you acquire a property. Well, nowadays, it's standard operating procedure for everyone, even in the private sector, to say, gee, is that property contaminated? And if it is, how is that going to affect what I'm going to do with it, the way I'm going to redevelop it? And across the country, there have been tribal response programs that have worked with tribal housing authorities to address these new properties. And it's not just acquiring new properties. It could be ongoing maintenance. For instance, there's a huge problem across the country with meth. And what's with meth? It's people, tenants in a housing authority could either be using the meth or they could be cooking it. And then they contaminate the unit. And how do you figure out how badly contaminated the unit is and what to do about it? You could talk to your tribal response program. And they've done that across the country, working with tribal housing authorities.
Yeah, I'll jump in. From the perspective of the Brownfields program, which is an EPA program, the goal is to take properties that may or may not have some contaminants, hazardous substances, pollutants, and get those safely reused. If it's an abandoned property, if it's an old house, as Eugene mentioned, maybe there might be a meth problem. You need to figure out what's there and if it needs some cleanup. And the site characterization step is finding out what is actually there and what might be needed to get it back into productive reuse.
And most of the time we have very limited resources, and we got to figure out, you know, what's the best way to use those resources. And you don't just want to make it up. You want your decisions to be fact-based. And that's where the site characterization and the tribal response program comes in. They could deliver the facts.
Awesome.
And for those who have heard some of our earlier podcasts, you know, this is the step where those data gathering procedures come in.
Gotcha. That makes
And
so much
it's
sense.
kind of twofold on these properties. There's the structures on the property, you know, where you might have some meth contamination, as our example we're using, you know, in some of the soft materials, the carpet, the wallboard, whatever. You also can have asbestos, lead-based paint, things of that issue with the structure. And then it's the contaminated media. You know, is there anything in the soil outside or in the groundwater lower in the property, you know, beneath the surface? You know, contamination that's remaining from any kind of commercial use, industrial use, maybe even migrating from somewhere off site. You know, there's a storage tank next door and there's been a leak. Maybe that's come over. So it's the building and it's characterizing, you know, the contamination that might be there in the media too.
And some of you are thinking, well, why should I be concerned about the soil, you know, the dirt that my house is built on? I'm not playing in the dirt every day. Well, there's two reasons for that. Number one, sure, you're not playing in it every day, but maybe you're digging a hole. Maybe you have a garden on your property. Maybe your children are playing with it, and that's a pathway for the contamination to affect human beings. And even more insidious than that is all modern buildings suck. What do I mean by that? Is they have a negative pressure. When you turn on your HVAC system and it heats up, it's pulling the air. It's pulling air into the furnace and then distributing it throughout the house. Well, if you have soil gas, like radon is a soil gas, but if there's contaminated groundwater, there could be some hydrocarbons or some contaminant could become a soil, volatilize, become a soil gas, and that's going to be sucked right into your building, and that's going to adversely affect the health and safety.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So if I were to want to get started in this process, what are some of the first steps in site characterization?
Well, in a bigger picture, a community kind of needs to identify which properties they want to revitalize and reuse first, and then select the ones that are the priorities, and then go ahead and do the site characterization. But to back up, you know, there's different priorities within any community about what is going to be reused for property. You know, there might be a need for more housing. So if you have some vacant houses, it's important to get these done. There might be a push for attracting new businesses, and you have some vacant buildings that would be good for that. So establishing your inventory of properties that need the characterization and then choosing the priorities kind of leads to getting you know, started on the characterization. But when you're ready to do the characterization, there's a couple different things that can happen. If a tribe is going to do it themselves, they have to think about how they're going to acquire an environmental consultant to do the work. Also, there's often the opportunity to have somebody else do a site characterization for you. In the Brownfields program, it kind of comes in more than one step. There's a phase 1 assessment and a phase 2 environmental assessment. And right now, because of the bipartisan infrastructure law, EPA is very well funded to do those for free for tribes. And that kind of goes with picking the priorities too, is what funding might be available at what time to come get these things done. You know, that changes from year to year, even as far as what EPA is able to do. But, you know, federal government, the states, if they are going to do these assessments for a tribe, you know, they'll be the ones hiring the contractor. If a tribe's going to be looking to do this themselves, they'll be the ones that have to set up a request for proposal, get bids, and then go hire the contractor.
Can we talk a little bit about, like, do we need a contractor, or where's the role of the contractor? Like, on one hand, we have tribal response programs in a lot of tribes. So we have people who are close to doing this, but on the other hand, there's this, when they set up the criteria that we're going to get into, like on how do you do a phase 1, how do you do a phase 2, it was set up by the American Society of Testing Materials, and this is from the 90s. And over the years, it's evolved that you have to have a qualified environmental professional who has to have very specific either educational or experience. And it's unusual to find somebody who's a qualified environmental professional within the strict criteria that's working for a tribal response program. And I've come into situations where the tribe works with a consultant, like Scott said, and there's a procedure you go through to, make sure you're hiring them properly. But where in the phase 1, as we're going to get into, a lot of that is just looking at reports, not actually looking at getting samples at the site. And someone who's not a full qualified environmental professional could do all that work as long as the qualified environmental professional signs off on it. So I'm sorry I went into this whole thing, but what I was getting at is that I've encountered situations where the tribal person does a lot of the work, working with and under the supervision of this consultant that they've hired. And in that way, you get the best of both worlds. You get your person who you trust, who's looking out for your interests, doing all this work, maybe has contacts with the tribe that knows things that are hard to find out. But you also have a professional looking it over and say, yeah, this fits within standard practice.
And also, like we talked about when we talked about data, if we want to incorporate traditional knowledge, if we want to be careful to be culturally sensitive, you want to not only choose your contractor very carefully and make sure that they have experience working with tribes, but your TRP person who is embedded in the tribe can do a lot of that work and then decide in the initial data gathering what should remain private and what should be public and what should be added to the reports and what the tribe wants to protect from being put in the reports. So that close working relationship between the environmental professional and the TRP person can be really beneficial for things like tribal sovereignty.
Very interesting.
Yeah, we've actually worked with some projects, Cynthia, where the tribal professional will have 2 separate reports being provided by the environmental professional. One of them is the one that goes on the public record for everyone to see. The other includes some of the sensitive information and is held just by the tribe and not released to everybody.
Right. For example, a really obvious case is that the tribe might not want to release archaeological site data. And so that might be in the report that goes to the tribe, but not necessarily released to the public because, of course, we're always very careful about not having archaeological sites rated. So, there's some real obvious reasons for that. And that's where you start thinking about when you set up your database, how you're going to use your coding system. You might have 2 different spreadsheets, one that has the cultural information, one that has the environmental information. In our brownfields inventory tool, there's the ability to put in information that's held within your account, but not sent to the EPA database. But that allows you to see the whole picture. And then, like we talked about before, to be very careful about how you set up your databases and what is appropriate to release and what's not appropriate to release.
Scott, Cynthia mentioned the brownfield inventory tool, and that's something that TAB developed. Maybe you might want to just tell our listeners what that is.
Sure. It is an online tool that we have here at KSU Tab, and it allows tribes, any community actually, to keep track of their inventory of brownfield properties. And for TRPs that have grants with EPA, you can directly transfer information from the BIT tool to the EPA acres system to meet reporting requirements. But as Cynthia mentioned, you choose the stuff that goes over. Within BIT, it also has a lot more fields than what EPA needs. And there's even a spot where you can add photos, entire reports. I mean, it's a really great storage system for information on properties. Some tribes even use it for more than just brownfields. They're using it for, you know, open dump sites, hazardous waste sites. One group is even using it just for kind of a real estate tracking thing for all vacant properties, whether there's any contamination or not. It's just a really useful tool, and there's mapping that goes with it. Cynthia's one of our experts on that, surely. So it's handy. It's a very good way to keep track of your information.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Scott. So, okay, so once we've gotten through the first step of, you know, which seems like the finding properties, how do you make that final decision on which properties to work on? Is it going through the data and, you know, working your way through that, or how does that go?
Often, and that's a community decision, and it's usually based on, you know, the need, you know, what properties you need to get back into productive reuse. And that's a fluid thing. You know, the needs change. A lot of places, when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden the property, you know, priorities changed. You know, things that they thought were important all of a sudden weren't, you know. There were areas where, you know, they kind of had some stuff on the back burner. One thing that came up in a couple spots, they wanted their local grocery store back. They didn't want people to have to travel. They wanted everything to be local. And so redeveloping, you know, some buildings and getting them reestablished as a local grocery was pretty important. But, you know, the priorities change, the funding can change what's available, and that might set a priority. It could be as simple as just your local leaders. You know, if you get new members on the tribal council and they have a different idea of what the priority is. You know, it's pretty fluid as to what, you know, the choices are.
And let me also mention that we do have another podcast with Paige Hinks talking about this whole site identification strategy and process.
And it seems, you know, Paige is, you know, there with the tribal response program, and a lot of times those folks are the ones that keep things consistent and moving forward, you know, in this. As local leaders change, you know, some of the professionals are the ones that keep things on track, you know, towards the long-term goals of getting all the properties assessed. So.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And so I know earlier you mentioned there's a phase 1 and a phase 2 and whatnot. So can you, if you determine in the process of doing all this that a phase 2 is necessary, what's the difference? What would that phase 2 tell you?
Well, go back to the phase 1 for a second. It is it's primarily a non-intrusive assessment of the property, which means they're not collecting samples. But what you have is there's a thorough records review in a phase 1. They look at the history of the property. The idea, the goal of that is to identify what they call RECs, recognize environmental conditions. And they're trying to find anything there that might be, you know, a health concern, a hazard going forward. And if those are identified, then in the phase 2, you'll actually take samples and see, you know, the extent of the contamination. You know, if it's in the building, the phase 2 might be a full asbestos survey or some sampling for, you know, lead-based paint. The phase 1 will be the step where that gets identified as a potential problem. So that's kind of how that works. The phase 2s are, you know, a totally separate event. You know, ideally, on a property, the phase one, it's very thorough. It looks at the property, it finds nothing wrong, and you're finished. That doesn't happen that often. If you've identified the site, it's likely you picked it for a reason. Also in the phase one, Eugene had mentioned vapor intrusion, things coming in due to the vacuum nature of a structure. And that's why you don't just look at the property, you look at the surrounding properties too. What was the use? I think they standardly go within a quarter mile on a phase one. They see everything in the area. And it could be, next door there was a release, and something got in the soil or the groundwater. It could be a little ways away with some manufacturing plant, and you have aerial deposition of metals contaminants in your yard. Things like that have to be looked at to totally evaluate a property. So the phase one looks at the subject property and kind of the surrounding area too.
I was just gonna ask, like, how far out does it go? Like, do you go to like look at the area?
I think quarter mile standard. Isn't that right, Eugene?
I actually, when there are criteria and for the phase one on what's your search radius, and generally most people even do it. They have services who do that, and for a lot of them, it's a half a mile.
Okay.
Oh, very cool. All right.
I
So,
what
oh, go ahead.
what I like to put a context for this also. Like we've talked about how we're trying to address health and safety. We're also trying to say, gee, economics have to work. We live in a free market economy, and if you want to develop a property, you have to have enough money to develop it. Then you have to have a cash flow afterwards to take care of operation and maintenance. And a lot of our listeners are working tribal housing authorities, and they've dealt with lead-based paint. And with lead-based paint, like we knew that there was some lead-based paint in older housing, anything that was built before 78. But does that mean that we were going to go in and do $40,000, $50,000 per unit abatement for every unit? No, we said let's have a gradual approach, figuring out, first of all, how much work are we putting in? And then is the unit really contaminated? And most of us that have done this, we know that there's a point where you could either assume lead-based paint, and if you're not doing that much work, we're not asking for much. We're either asking for lead-safe practices or interim controls. And it's only if we're really putting in more than 25,000 a unit that we're being asked to abate it. And at that point, maybe we want to know exactly where it is, and we'll take an XRF gun and we'll shoot samples all over and get the data. And it's a similar situation here with brownfield redevelopment. If we're doing a property, acquiring a property or building something, and it's always been a field, or maybe there's been housing there, and we do the data search, and that's all we find. So we say there are no recognized environmental conditions. We don't feel we have to get samples to figure out if there's contamination here. We may be wrong, but 99% of the time we're going to be right. But if there was a factory there before, if there's a record of a spill that took place before, if there was a gas station on that parcel, then hey, that's a recognized environmental condition. You're nuts if you don't take a sample and figure out exactly what's there and how to deal with it. So first of all, I want to set up that, and then the other point I want to set up is, hey, even if a site's contaminated, that doesn't mean you dig up the whole site and you put in new soil. You figure out where is the contamination and how bad is it. Sometimes we leave the contamination in sight, and we have what we call a risk-based corrective action, where we say that we're going to leave it in sight, but we're going to isolate it, and nobody's ever going to come in contact with this contamination again. But the only way we know how to plan the cleanup and figure out what to do is if we have data. The only way we have data is if we first do the phase one to figure out, do we need sampling? And then if the phase one tells us we need sampling, then we do the sampling, and then we figure out where to do the sampling.
Is it often where it is localized in just one area versus like the whole property? Is that something that happens often?
Hey, I'll jump in, but I think Scott actually has a lot more experience on this. He was one of the people running the tank program in Kansas for years and years. But I had a friend, his daughter and my daughter were friends, and when I used to do environmental training at HUD and we'd talk about site contamination, he'd come in and talk about it. And he says once he got a call from EPA and they said, hey, you did this study 7 years ago and you said there are no recognized environmental conditions. And now we're doing a cleanup. And what happened? And the story he told was that he went to this plant and he said, oh, did you ever dump anything here? And they said, oh, no, we never did. The plant manager, oh, we never did anything. And you know, whatever. So whatever they did, they didn't find anything serious. 7 years later, the company's been acquired. The new owners fire the plant manager, and the plant manager says, oh, we dumped a whole bunch of barrels out the back door. In other words, right where he was standing when he spoke to my friend and said there was nothing there, he knew there was stuff there. So it's like you never know what's going to happen. And quite frankly, in the past, we're talking about things that may have been there 100 years ago, 150 years ago. All these environmental laws were only passed in the 80s that you have to send it to a licensed landfill. Before that, the law of the land was you dump it on your own property. And as long as you're not interfering with the use and enjoyment of adjacent landowners, that was what you were supposed to do. So it's not unusual for these older sites to find not good stuff on there.
Yeah, and Eugene, you touched on something earlier too, and that's the knowledge of the local folks. You know, you can have an environmental professional doing a phase 1 environmental assessment, but you know, they're not from there usually. And the best way for those to happen is if there are interviews as part of that with the local people. You know, find out what happened on that property. Particularly in tribal settings, sometimes there's not a whole lot of public record other than, you know, kind of the verbal record and what's been, you know, passed down as to, hey, here's where this happened. And, you know, sometimes, you know, things that are older, particularly environmental issues that happened before all these laws and regulations, there's not a good record of releases or operations. And so talking to the folks that have been there a while at the location is the way to find some of that out.
And it's not just urban and it's not just industrial. If you're in a rural setting, it can be things like cow dips. It can be pesticide storage. You know, out here on our farms, we see a lot of things that need to be identified that if you're only thinking urban, if you're only thinking gas station, things of that sort, you might not think about sheep dips and use of some pretty strong chemicals. One particular problem is when there's storage. So there might be storage of pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers in a shed or in a warehouse. If that's been abandoned, those containers can break down and the chemicals can mix. And then you have a fairly complex situation of identifying those breakdown products might be more toxic than the original products were. And so in rural settings, you also have to think about these things.
But
yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Yep.
I want to also bring it back in terms of site characterization. Why are we doing site characterization? There's two things. First of all, you're really supposed to do this before you buy a property. That's one of the problems with tribal and in Indian country is that often the tribe acquires a property without doing a site characterization, and then when they're ready to use it or use federal funds and there's a requirement to do it, they find out and hopefully they're not too surprised with big dollar signs on how much it's going to clean it up, let alone the liability that may ensue. Even though tribes are liable under CERCLA with Superfund, individual owners are, and going through a Superfund cleanup is not a fun thing. It's everybody shares the pain. Let's put it that way. But first of all, you're acquiring the property. You're doing a phase one, characterizing it, and we're a phase two because you want to know, do I want to acquire the property? So if the contamination could be so bad that you say, I don't want to go anywhere near it. But actually, in a tribe, mostly that's your tribal land. You usually do want to do something about it, even if it is severely contaminated. The other point is, well, what's it going to cost me to clean this up, and where am I going to get the funds? Like to develop a local grocery store that Scott was mentioning, we figure out, well, how much does it cost to acquire the property, to build it, to run it and operate it? We develop a pro forma and we see if the numbers work. Well, if there's a big site development cost to clean that up, that's not going to happen unless, and this happens all the time, we come up with some government funding to fill the gap, to figure out how to make the property work, how to do the cleanup. And we can't do that. We can't even apply for the funds unless we have a ballpark estimate of what it's going to cost. And we only get that when we've done the site characterization.
Makes sense. And so now my
And-
next question is going to be, how do you get all of this done? So who does the assessment? Who pays for it? Is it EPA, ONAP? What do we got going on?
Well, I had mentioned the EPA has some funds for this. And actually, in some states, depends on the relationships between tribes and the state, sometimes the state can provide some assessments as well. Usually that's kind of the first choice, and if that isn't there, then it goes to EPA. If you're requesting, they call it a TBA, a targeted brownfields assessment. And as I mentioned, right now there's a lot of money for that. The brownfields program received a lot of the infrastructure law money, and so for the next few years, EPA is going to have some money to do these assessments. It's something that can also, particularly just at the phase one stage, those are not that costly. And so if a tribe wants to get the first step done, perhaps somebody is wanting to donate land to the tribe and they just want to do a quick check. Okay, is this a problem or not before we accept that? Sometimes when you go through the EPA or other federal sources, it might take a while to get the assessment. And so the time frame is kind of important too. And, might be able to get a phase one for a few $1,000s and, at least identify the concerns right off the bat, even if it's not been sampled yet. So sometimes doing it, independently is a good idea.
Yeah, let me say for like HUD funded projects, HUD requires you to do at least the phase one. And if the phase one says there are recognized environmental conditions, then you have to do the phase two if you're going to go ahead with that property, and that's recognized as a development cost. On the other hand, if there's a cleanup, if it's a minor cleanup, sure, it could be absorbed in the project development cost. But if it's more than a minor, you're probably going to have to go elsewhere to fill that gap. And that's what TAB could help you do is identify where you could go. Like what are their funding? Sometimes it's U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's a lot of federal agencies and we'll discuss this at some time in the future, that have money available that even though they're not advertised, promoted as this is our brownfield program, basically they could be used for brownfield projects. And there's lots of other money out there besides government money that can find a way to fit in.
Yeah, as Eugene mentioned, we have that's one of the things that Tribal Tab can help with. We have partners that are kind of experts on economic redevelopment, and they're tied into a lot of the federal funding and the different resources that are out there.
Well, since you guys mentioned all of this wonderful work that you guys do, what are some contact information and resources that our listeners can tap into to reach you guys and access all of this?
Website, www.ksutab.org. NAHASDA.org. There's also a separate page for Tribal Tab we're working on building up. And it has good information. It has a lot of examples of past successful projects, grant applications, things of that nature. Also on there is our contact information as individuals. I'm at scottKnight@ksu.edu. Anybody can contact me directly. Be happy to help folks and get them tied in with the resources they need.
Eugene, Cynthia, do you guys want to plug yourselves?
Well,
We're
Scott
part of the
has
TAB team.
everyone's contact information.
Okay, good. Okay, well, do you guys have anything else you want to share with our listeners? Crystal, do you have any follow-up questions?
Nope, I think it's great that TAB exists to be able to help, our tribes either fill in that gap or seek some answers for, questions that they might have and where they're lost in this whole process. So thank you guys for joining us.
I just like to say, like, this is one of those areas where kids don't try this at home. It's very strict protocols. We're dealing with serious health and safety, and here's free technical assistance. So I don't know, from my point of view, if I found myself that somebody's talking about phase ones and phase twos and characterized sites, I want to run to my tribal response program, if there is one there. That's the people I want to speak to first. And then I want to ask them, hey, do we want to ask TAB for a little help? Maybe get some outside help money in here too. I don't see the downside.
Definitely. And it's a program for all tribes, right? Not just a specific state or anything. So that's beautiful. So thank you guys so much. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back off to Cora for closing.
Awesome. So again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Eugene, for joining us for yet another wonderful episode. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in for another amazing experience. I feel like I'm learning so much in each one of these episodes. So please be sure to come back for more content and go to our website, www.nativelearningcenter.com. There you can find more information on the Hobothina podcast, our cathedral webinars, and our virtual trainings. And make sure to like and subscribe to our podcast here on Simplecast, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and come back for more content. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And that's a wrap.
Thank you, listeners.